Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you all are doing wonderful on this, uh, what is a beautiful Thursday night right now here in Columbus, Ohio. Not sure where you are. I saw a couple of you have come in from, let's see, Oklahoma City and Alabama and a bunch of different places. So grateful to see you. Dalton, Georgia, yes, absolutely. So wonderful to see you all again after a couple of weeks of being out and about. The storms, in fact, aren't coming until tomorrow now. In fact, obviously, if you think back into what was all happening last week at this time when the storms were starting to come through, especially even up in our area and the rest, and hit Mississippi. And so I just want to note really quickly that all those that have been in the area that are in Mississippi, those of you who are down there in that area that was hit very hard, some tragic loss of life and the rest. I mean, just truly breaks my heart. And y'all have been in our prayers consistently for that. I have spent a lot of time through the years uh, in uh, in areas of where tornadoes and the rest come through. I was in Alabama during the what was the April 27th tornadoes quite a few years ago. I think 2012, where I think it was almost 180 or 200 plus people were killed across the day. And spent 37 days in a row in Tuscaloosa doing cleanup and the rest at that time when I was living in Birmingham. And so, my prayers for all those who are affected by that, and also for those, it looks like tomorrow is another one of those days. So, please be safe if you're going to be in that realm, in that arena. It looks like it's mostly going to be across central Arkansas, Mississippi, and Tennessee, and the rest. And so, please be safe during those areas. Take your precautions as much as you can. And it's not lost on me that we are specifically on this night discussing the very premise of climate change, especially climate change and Christianity. And so I'm just not, surprised that, especially this time of the year, is a fairly common occurrence that there are these weather patterns that happen consistently during the spring and the rest, especially as things come about. And so there was no purpose for that. There was no, this was literally just put on a list, and then this is kind of the dates in which it fell. But I am eternally grateful for your continued presence, for those of you who keep coming back. I've joked about it that some of you guys are just gluttons for punishment, or more than anything, you're just as fascinated as I am by some of these topics and some of these conversations. And I really am. I'm grateful for your continued presence, the growth of this group. Every week, there's new individuals who come in, and I know they go back and watch the videos. I will note one thing. In fact, it was noted to me that some of the videos on Facebook at times are skipping or causing problems or not going clearly. I have noticed that. In fact, one of the things I have also done is I have recordings of all of these, and I have placed them on YouTube. I will post the link. They're not private, but they're just not public. They're not put out there to where everybody can see them. I don't share those typical links. There's more of a backup than anything for those very reasons. And so I will actually go back and post those in the group so that you can actually see those directly to YouTube, which tends to stream better. Facebook, for whatever reason. I'm not a huge conspiracy theorist in and of itself. I joke all the time. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do have questions. And there are moments where, especially some of the topics we've been discussing, have, for whatever reasons, the videos at times don't always play. They don't always do what they're supposed to. I also work with technology a lot, and that's just life sometimes. So I don't want to fall into a trap of assuming some type of situation where things are not what they seem to be, or implying something that there's not. I'm also just not so naive as to think that all things are just, all things always just go wrong. Sometimes there are forces and other things that work against you. It is what it is, and we do our best, and we continue to be as truthful and honest as we can, and as open as we can. It's the one thing that I hope you found about this study is, while I do absolutely 100% portray my personal opinions on these topics, I do try to do the research to find different aspects of it, to make sure I'm reading the materials from the different perspectives and the different sides of the arguments, not to find consensus. In fact, consensus is not my goal. I am a big believer that at times consensus is actually the worst thing one can come to, because if you're looking for a common ground, you might miss out on the fact that there is a specific truth to be had. And so I find myself going, I'm not looking to find the common ground. I'm looking for that which is true. And that is not a postmodern mentality. In fact, most of our world today, postmodernism is the goal. Postmodernism is this idea of truth is relative. You have your truth, I have mine. I don't believe in that. I don't believe that that truth is relative. I believe that truth is just not just objectively, but it's objectively true, that you can find it, that you can see it, that you can believe it. And I believe, and it's been my strong conviction for a long time, that truth is found not just in God's word, but in God. So beyond just the scriptures themselves, and I want you to hear this, beyond the scriptures, that God exists outside the Bible, that I believe in God and the way he manifests through creation, how he manifests through lots of different, not necessarily experiences, but through creation, through history, through the things we can learn, that he can be found in so many different ways, outside of just scripture alone. Scripture guides us 100%. It is there's but one way to the Father, it's through Jesus the Son. But so much of what we can learn can also, that God's fingerprints are everywhere. That's ultimately what I'm getting at. As an example, I shared this a couple of weeks ago. One of my first days in China, in fact, it was my first night in China. I got a knock on the door at about 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning, and there was a young Chinese girl there holding a little piece of paper out, and it just had one little question on it, and it said, "What is God?" And I was fascinated by that question, blown away by that question. And I had to remind myself that God, for whatever reason, in whatever way, had already been at work on her heart long before I stepped foot in that place. I don't know the how, I don't know the why, I don't know any of those things. I just know that God had gotten to a point where she was being led, or she felt led to reach out to someone to ask the questions that she had. So I don't want to negate the work of the Spirit, the work of God in any way, through science, through all of these different ways in which God manifests himself. I do not believe that God is separated from these things. So, with that in mind, and having said that, I am super excited about this discussion. Also, and not necessarily terrified, but I do want y'all to notice something that happened. So, let me throw this up there so you can see it, because this happened just a little. When I posted last week, I specifically know I hate to do it, but it seems like I need to postpone tonight's discussion on climate change, as my internet has been a bit wonky today. It's most likely because we have some stronger storms coming through in the next 10 hours or so, already beginning in our area. I would hate to begin and then have to drop out over and over, and this has also given me some new time to dive deeper into the topic. See you all next week. Now, did you notice what showed up at the bottom? Did you notice this? It's still there. I just went and saw it in the rest. And so when I saw this pop up, I went, oh, this is like one of those object lesson ways in which you can show a little bit about what's happening. So give me a thumbs up, a like or something, or just tell me if you notice this on this, or if you've noticed things like this popping up on different times when you use that terminology. Because notice, I didn't post an article, I didn't post anything. I simply used the terminology climate change, and this popped up on this social media. So how many of you noticed that? Did anybody see this too? I find it incredibly humorous that it did. So let me know, did you see that? How many of you actually noticed that lovely little note that popped up? Or you may be fairly commented. You may see this quite a bit across Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, things of that nature. So I'd love to know if you noticed this in any way, shape, or form. So put that in the chat and let me know. But I found this fascinating because as I was preparing for things, this allowed me to take a look at the things that I'd studied. So it's the first time you've seen this specific note. Okay, that's fine. So it's an interesting one, right? Like there's some different ones to it. It's a very generic concept. And you have seen others, yes, without a doubt. So let me notice something else that happens. This is what happens when you click on it. So I clicked on it, and this is what it leads to. And it just pops up this, where it says 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming. Now, I want to go back real quick and notice something. Notice what's saying. Here it says, see how the average temperature in your area is changing. Explore climate science info. That's what it says. So I clicked on it, and it pops up, and it says this. And nothing could have been better for what I was going to speak on tonight than for this being the overall aspect of what was being set forth. I am fascinated by this. This is still the propagation of what is specifically being put forth. And so I'll read this. It says 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming. At least 97% of published climate experts agree that global warming is real and caused by humans. The myth that scientists disagree on climate change sometimes comes from misleading petitions that don't accurately represent the climate science community. These open petitions typically include non-scientists and scientists working in unrelated fields. Among scientists who study and publish research on the Earth's climate, there is overwhelming agreement that human-caused global warming is happening. So I want to throw that out there as a starting point. This is what, even on Facebook, where we are right now, this is the concept, the agenda. This is what's being set forth. This is the information that is provided for you and to you very quickly. Like literally one click in, this is where you are to be. This is where you are to live. This is the expectation. This is what is the standard accepted practice. In fact, the 97% is actually a very common number that I hear all the time. I heard it a ton in specifically a lot in grad school at Harvard. I didn't hear it nearly as much when we were talking about philosophy at Cambridge, but Harvard all the time, especially in one of my courses on climate change, dealt with it a lot. And so, yes, Dean, I am wearing your hat. I'm prepping to go and join Dean this weekend in Virginia for a college retreat. So grateful that we'll get to spend some time together. So I did wear the hat specifically tonight for this very moment. Plus, climate change and the rest felt like kind of an apologetics kind of thing to deal with. So here's one of the things I want you to note. And so when somebody makes a statistical quote, especially something on 97%, instantly my red flags go up. Because I don't know about your experience with humanity in general, but 97% is about as close to 100% as you really can get. The idea that there is a consensus in the scientific community. And I think we're a little bit more skeptical. In fact, I know we're a lot more skeptical about the scientific community because of the last couple of years, because the scientific community seems to have become so politicized. And so because that is the premise, and that's where we're at, and that's the mindset, in fact, that I think we would be a fairly common we could agree on that. We are more skeptical of these numbers. But what I really need us to get is the idea that 97% of anybody agrees on something is most likely going to have some type of agenda to it. And the reason I say most likely is because even if you look at people who agree on something, for example, you and I might say, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. The idea that we would agree on all things when it comes to even Christianity and faith is an absurd notion. Even within the disciples and the rest, there was disagreements on things. Paul and Barnabas disagreed on how to do things. The idea that there is this consensus concept that you can get at. And so anytime I see a data point like that, my first thought is, ooh, that's unlikely. That's highly unlikely. And I do want to note how they quantify it. So note again how they quantify it. They specifically say 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming. At least 97% of published climate experts agree that global warming is real and caused by humans. Now, that's the claim. 97% of published climate experts agree that global warming is real and caused by humans. Now, what happens when you do a research into this and find out, is it real? So here's an article that I noted that I found, and I'm going to give you some basic highlights of this. This is actually a Forbes article. And so I wanted to look at articles that would not necessarily be far right, far left, anti-science, and so forth. I wanted to try to find those that might be in the consensus middle, and try to find those that would be even skeptical, or they shouldn't necessarily be skeptical, and this is one of those. And so I'll read a couple notes from this where he says, if you've ever expressed the least bit of skepticism about environmentalists' calls for making the vast majority of fossil fuels use illegal, you probably heard the smug response, 97% of climate scientists agree with climate change, which always carries the implication, who are you to challenge them? The answer is, and I love this, it says you are a thinking independent individual and you don't live by polls, let alone secondhand account of polls. You go by facts, logic, and explanation. And can we be honest? That's really what we're doing in this whole entire concept, this whole entire online study, is to look at things objectively. We don't do things by consensus. We don't do things by polls alone. We look at what is available to us. So here are two questions to ask when somebody says this 97%. What exactly do climate scientists agree on is a great question to start. And this is what they would directly notice, that climate change is real. So which causes the question, what is that supposed to mean? That climate changes? That we have some impact? That we have a large impact? That we have a catastrophically large impact? That we have such a catastrophic impact that we shouldn't use fossil fuels? What you'll find is that people don't want to define what the 97% agree on, because there's nothing remotely in the literature saying that 97% would actually ban fossil fuel use. It's likely the 97% of people making the 97% claim have absolutely no idea where that number comes from. In fact, isn't that the next best question? Where does that come from? Where does this number come from? What happened? What study? And so forth. And in fact, here's where it does. If you look at the literature, the specific meaning of 97% claim is 97% of climate scientists agree that there is a global warming trend and that human beings are the main cause. That's what I noted earlier. That is, that we are over 50% responsible for the change in weather. The warming is a whopping zero point 0.8 degrees over the past 150 years. A warming that has actually tapered off to essentially nothing in the last decade and a half. Even if 97% of climate scientists agreed with this, and even if they were right, it in no way or shape or form would actually change anything with what we've done and how we are living. So basically, the 97% claim doesn't even remotely justify many of the policies and the concept that which we claim, because it doesn't actually say or imply something bigger than that 0.8% over the last 150 years, which has been during the height of the Industrial Revolution. That 0.8%. Now, notice also, I am staying specifically over the last 150 years, because if they were to go back over the last 10,000 years, give or take 6 to 10,000 years, you're actually going to find it's up and down, up and down, up and down, even before there was the mass population or the use of human beings with the CO2 emissions and all of these other things. And so they always place it within a specific time period of, by the way, during the Industrial Revolution, without trying to look at all as to what changed or how the Earth fluctuated in its actual degrees of rising heat and temperatures and the rest prior to 150 years ago. And it's also the concept of this concept of 97% is the ultimate thing. So I went down the rabbit hole to find where do we get this 97%, and here's where it comes from. So to elaborate, almost no one who refers to 97% has any idea about where they're actually getting this number from. But the basic way it works is that a researcher reviewed a specific number of scholarly papers and classified them by how many agree with a certain position. So I need you to get that. A researcher reviewed a specific number of scholarly papers and classified them by how many agree with a certain position. So unfortunately, in the case of the 97% of climate scientists agreeing that human beings are the main cause of warming, the researcher, and this is an opinion of this author, engaged in what he calls egregious misconduct, and he gives how. So the original concept comes from one of the main papers behind the 97% claim is authored by John Cook, who runs a popular website called Skeptical Science. And it's kind of a virtual encyclopedia of arguments trying to defend specifically catastrophic, the end of the world. And so here is Cook's summary of his paper. So this is directly from his paper. Cook, in 2013, found that over 97% of papers he surveyed endorsed the view that the Earth is warming up and human emissions of greenhouse gases are the main cause. Now, this is a fairly clear statement. 97% of papers surveyed endorsed the view that man-made greenhouse gases were the main cause. Main in common usage, meaning more than 50%. Okay? But even a quick scan of the paper reveals that this is not the case. Cook is able to demonstrate only that a relatively handful endorse the view that the Earth is warming up and human emissions of greenhouse gases are the main cause. Cook calls this explicit endorsement with quantification, which means that those authors are saying this is causing more than 50%. The problem is only a small percentage of the papers fall into that category. Cook does not say what percentage, but when the study was published and challenged by economist David Friedman, one observer actually calculated only 1.6% explicitly stated that man-made greenhouse gases caused at least 50% of global warming. Where did most of the 97% come from then, if only 1.6% of the actual papers were found to say those specific things? Cook had created what he called explicit without qualification. That is, papers in which the author, by Cook's admission, did not say whether 1% or 50% or 100% of the warming was caused by man. He had also created a category called implicit endorsement for papers that imply but don't say that there is some man-made global warming, and doesn't quantify it at all. In other words, he created two categories that he labeled as endorsing a view where they most certainly did not. The 97% claim is a deliberate misrepresentation designed to intimidate the public and numerous scientists whose papers were classified by Cook. So as an example, Dr. Richard Toll, one of the papers that he cited, he said, Cook surveys included 10 of my 122 eligible papers. 5 out of the 10 were rated incorrectly. 4 out of the 5 were rated as endorse rather than neutral or against. Dr. Craig Idso says, this is not an accurate representation of my paper. Dr. Nir Shaviv wrote, nope, this is not an accurate representation. Dr. Nicolas Scafetta wrote, Cook et al. In 2013 is based on a straw man argument. Think about how many times, and note also, I'm going to go right back to it. Look right here. Where does this right here come from? It comes from that paper. And when you go down further into the rabbit hole, what do you find? You find that 97% is a flawed argument. In fact, at best, based off of just the papers that were there at that time, only 1.6% of those actually explicitly stated that man-made greenhouse gases actually causes global warming. That is less than the percentage he's claiming says does not. So in and of itself, this is highly problematic because this is simply going down. This is why climate change and climate discussions and climate alterations and global warming and all these other things has become such a hard thing to talk about, because when you actually look beyond just these notes. Now, if I click on the NASA, which is what I did, by the way, I really wanted to go down these rabbit holes and click on the NASA, the different things to find what I could find. And let me see if I can pull it up here real quick. And let's get to the scientific aspect. So here's what I found myself on. Scientific consensus, Earth's climate is warming. And so notice again, like I said, I'm really trying to be fair and just and clicking on the links that they're giving me, the resources and the rest. And just before we go through some of this other stuff, I want to come down here and notice what I'm going to highlight right here. There's John Cook et al. Consensus on consensus, a synthesis of consensus estimates on human-caused global warming. That is the 97%. Here it is again, another one, environmental research, 97%. This is it again. This is the entire concept. So this is who they're citing, is they're citing that specific paper. They're citing that specific concept of his gathering. So it's not like 97% of scientists got together and decided they all agree. This is the interpretation of one, John Cook and his research assistants who gathered the papers, set forth a designation of how they would classify supporting and non-supporting, and classified basically 97% of all scientific papers as supporting when only 1.6% actually did. Explicitly did. Whereas the rest of them directly spoke to the opposite side. Now, if I can be honest with you, if I could ask this question, how many of you knew that? How many of you have heard that, knew that, or had an expectation, or knew that that was the case? And I might even ask how many of you had heard the 97% before. I hear it all the time. I mean, I heard it for years. How many of you have heard that or know anything about that in any way? I'd be interested to know. So you can tell me in the chat and the rest, and we'll figure out what that looks like. Okay. Was written 2010 years ago when I was an undergrad in grad school. We were encouraged to find sources when the past 5 years. So many things could have changed. Absolutely. So they could have. So I've actually been looking, but the problem is, if you notice, what's still the main source cited? So the main source cited, that's the problem. They're still using the same 97% argument from before, because I don't think the actual science has changed. I don't think the scientists haven't changed their minds. And this is where I want to be very fair to the scientists, especially the ones who wrote papers that did not say what people were claiming they said. And so this is part of the disruption of the scientific community, where it's become the politicization of the community in and of itself. So you're 100% right that it is absolutely something where over the last 5 years you want to find the newer stuff. But right now, in today, in fact, if I were to, I don't even know if I have it right now, but let me see if I can pull this up. So you see right here. So this is again where I clicked on Facebook. The top thing about it is that still that same argument. So you're 100% right. There are new articles and the rest. I'm going off of what is being portrayed and put forth as the standard for climate change understanding, the cause of global warming, all of these different things. And it's simply not what we think it is. It's simply not. And I'm trying to be honest here, but I also believe I could say I do not think this is being intellectually honest, especially since this has been, and I don't like to use the word debunked, because debunking assumes that the people who wrote that, the 97%, did not have anything to do with that paper, did not have anything to do with the interpretation that was set forth. John Cook et al., those individuals, I absolutely believe they have been misleading. Um, I think it's bad that the same standard from 10 years ago, 100%, especially in light of what we hopefully have learned and grown from there, right? Yes, I think it's bad that the same standard from 10 years ago is still being used. It's horrific. Now, here's the problem. If there was a newer standard, if there was new science that had come out that's shown these things, then that might also be something that would be helpful. Now, we have a couple of problems. One of those main things is that for the last 50 years, and I will use the word climate science extremists, climate science, especially people whose career or livelihood depends on these types of things in a big way, have been exceptionally wrong. I mean, just horrifically wrong on their predictions. I mean, on a scale that if anybody else were as wrong about certain things, not only would you get fired, but you'd be laughed out of the room. I'm thinking about some fairly, well, I mean, candidly, some fairly crazy statements that have been said, and I've got a couple just to give you some ideas, but I want to give you direct quotes and so forth. Because Earth Day started in 1970, I think was the first Earth Day, which is where we were coming through this concept of an eco concept. It was where we had almost like the eco terrorism that happened in the 70s, the 80s, and the rest, trying to save the world. So there was some fairly incredible things that were said during that time and this Earth Day concept. And believe it or not, I will get to the point of how Christians should deal with the earth and deal with what we have and so forth. But I wanted to deal also with climate change on the whole and some of the things that are set forth. So here's some direct quotes and the rest that were stated from back in the day, that these are real things. So Harvard biologist George Wald estimated that civilization will end within 15 or 30 years, which in his case was by 1985 or 2000, unless immediate action is taken against problems facing mankind. Then we have Washington University biologist Barry Commoner on the Earth Day issue of the scholarly journal Environment wrote, "We are in an environmental crisis that threatens the survival of this nation and of the world as a suitable place for human habitation." That was in 1971. On that first Earth Day, the New York Times editorial page warned, "Man must stop pollution and conserve his resources, not merely to enhance existence, but to save the race from intolerable deterioration and possible extinction." Now, you may hear some of these and go, "Well, these don't sound that bad." I get that. So don't miss also the time period we were in and so forth. Number 4, we had population will inevitably and completely outstrip whatever small increases in food supplies we make. This is Paul Ehrlich. Confidently saying this in 1970 issue of Mademoiselle. So the death rate will increase until at least 100 to 200 million people per year will be starving to death by the next 10 years, which was 1980. Most of the people who are going to die in the greatest cataclysm in the history of man have already been born. Also, Paul Ehrlich in 1969, writing an essay called Eco-Catastrophe. He said by 1975, experts feel that food shortages will have escalated the present level of world hunger and starvation into famines of unbelievable proportions. Other experts, more optimistic, think the ultimate food population collision will not occur until the decade of the 1980s. And this was all surrounding, by the way, the concept of a climate change, but specifically an ice age. Another ice age was going to be coming in the 70s and 80s. Ehrlich sketched out probably his most alarmist concept in 1970 on the Progressive. It was an issue showing readers that between 1980 and 1989, some 4 billion people, including 65 million Americans, would perish in the Great Die-Off. It is already too late to avoid mass starvation, declared Dennis Hayes, chief organizer of Earth Day, in the spring issue of The Living Wilderness. Peter Gunter, North Texas State University professor, wrote in 1970, demographers agree almost unanimously on the following grim timeline. By 1975, widespread famines will begin in India. They will spread by 1990 to include all of India, Pakistan, China, the Near East, and Africa. By the year 2000, or conceivably sooner, South and Central America will exist under complete famine conditions. By the year 2000, 30 years from now, the entire world, with the exception of Western Europe, North America, and Australia, will be in a severe famine. In January 1970, Life reported, scientists have solid experimental and theoretical evidence to support the following predictions. In a decade, urban dwellers will have to wear gas masks to survive air pollution. By 1985, air pollution will have reduced the amount of sunlight reaching Earth by 1/2. Ecologist Kenneth Watt told Time magazine that at the present rate of nitrogen buildup, it's only a matter of time before light will be filtered out of the atmosphere and none of our land will be usable. Barry Commoner predicted that decaying organic pollutants would use up all of the oxygen in Americans' rivers, causing freshwater fish to suffocate by the 1980s. Paul Ehrlich, another one, chimed in, predicting in 1970 that air pollution is certainly going to take hundreds of thousands of lives in the next few years alone. Ehrlich sketched a scenario in which 200,000 Americans would die in 1973 during smog disasters in New York and Los Angeles. So I wanted to note these real quick. Not because it's easy for me to look at that and look back and go, wow, how wrong they were, how off they were on some things. Because I do want to note that there have been things that we have done between now and then, and what we did between the moments when those statements were said later on, that actually alleviated those problems. In fact, human ingenuity is one of the reasons why these catastrophe concepts that people constantly throw out, I really truly struggle with. I struggle with them because they make definitive statements based off of the idea, and it's like to say, if we stay the current course, as if that's ever been mankind, as if we were always going to stay the certain course. So I don't want to miss out on the fact that there have been changes in how we deal with things, and there have been positive things that have been set forth by the scientific community on how we deal with smog, how we deal with pollution, how we deal with a lot of different things that have to do with a lot of this stuff. And so I don't want to miss out on that. I don't want to dismiss these. What I'm utilizing these things for is these alarmist concepts. Don't miss the idea, though, that they're also directly tied to especially in our day and age, more so than ever, political action, political concepts. They're tied to big money. They're tied to money concepts. It's not all about the science. And in fact, I don't believe I would have a hard time saying, and this is my personal opinion, that even 50% of it is about the science, nearly as much as it's about the industries behind it. Now, that goes just as much for climate change advocates as it does for fossil fuel advocates and the rest. Okay, so I want us to have a clear understanding on that. I'm not taking a side on this. I'm saying the politicization of climate change and climate science has been catastrophic for us because it's made us cynical towards what is real and what is not. What is a real threat and what is not. I mean, we live in a world where everything is the end of the world. Everything is a disaster. Everything is coming to an end. And over again, this is the world in which we live in. And I don't know about you, but it's hard for me to believe any of it in some ways. Because I look at this and I go, well, I can guarantee you that's almost not going to happen. I mean, in New York City, I think it was in 2000, in one of Al Gore's movies in mid to early to 2000, said that New York City by 2012 was going to be under a foot of water. It's not the case. That, you look at, by the way, it's one of my favorite things because you guys have seen it before. How many of you have seen the photos of the polar bears that are like emaciated, that are like dying out and the rest? They always show those kind of things, and they show that in a lack of whatever it may be. Greenland and, the ice cap and all the rest of it, like it's melting away. It's not actually like ice. The ice cap is actually larger than it's ever been right now, at least ever been in the last 150 years or so. That when you take those polar bears and when it references their habitat is literally because ice flows change, they break off, they do different things along the way. But beyond that, typically those emaciated polar bears are older polar bears. Have you ever asked yourself what happens to an old polar bear when it's not fast enough or strong enough to hunt anymore? What happens? They die. And so oftentimes you would see these photos of these emaciated polar bears when in reality they're older bears who are literally dying out in very natural ways. And so there's been this misrepresentation at times to push agendas. And so there is without a doubt, a climate agenda. Don't miss that. There is a climate agenda, 100%, but it doesn't mean it's inherently evil. I don't want to fall into that trap either. That there are good things that we need to be doing. I lived in a city of Wuhan, China for 2 years, and I'm telling you, the smog and the stuff, there was days where, not to be crass or crude, there were days where you'd go home and you'd blow your nose and it would be black almost. I do not miss those days. I do not miss the fact that there has been changes in how we deal with pollution, how we deal with a lot of things I think are good. It's even not just good, but good for us to be healthier in the way we live. But there are some major things that we are not doing well with when it comes to evaluating what is real and what is not. What is just climate alarmism? What is this idea of, right now I saw today even climate change is an existential threat to mankind. Anytime I hear things like that, my instant reaction is going to be no. That is an overplaying of the situation. Give me the details. Tell me what's actually happening. Give me the real things. Because what happens is, oftentimes you'll end up with a paper or something. When I look at something and go, that's not existential. That's existential to your main source of income, or that's existential into your main source of whatever it may be. So a couple more things that I want to dive into, especially as how climate change has done a disservice to itself, the climate agenda has done a disservice to itself, is if you look back in the 1970s, global cooling was actually the biggest concept. Global cooling was there was going to be a new ice age. In fact, it was in Time Magazine, Life Magazine, and the rest, that by the mid 1970s, 1980s, there was going to be, because of air pollution and the rest, and we were going to work through the ozone layer, there was going to be a new ice age, highly problematic concept. And then when that didn't happen, it morphed into climate. It became into what do we call it? I just want to so we have the ice age, then you have the global warming. Yeah, so the global warming concept, which just came in. I mean, Carl Sagan, even in the 1980s and 1990s, was still presenting global cooling as one of the major things that was existentially a threat to all of us. Another one that's become part of the climate agenda is the concept of overpopulation. Environment, and I'm talking about specifically human beings. There are ads out in, I think it's in Oregon right now, that specifically are saying people to stop having babies. Overpopulation is killing the world. We should stop this. And in fact, one of the things we were told that by the year 2000, when we were going to reach the 7 billion mark, there was no way we could support this. Mass catastrophes, people starving to death. In fact, that was a lot of those notes and quotes that I read to you earlier were specific about that. But in fact, the exact opposite have happened. And this is a fascinating thing, which, by the way, if every single human being in the world were placed in the same city, so for example, like Los Angeles, standing shoulder to shoulder all around us and the rest, you could fit every one of the people in the world in the city of Los Angeles. All of them standing next to each other. The concept of overpopulation is a false concept that hasn't actually aged well at all. Previous trends, by the way, so for a long time, the previous trends on food growth and food population, the rest, was absolutely way, way, way off when it came to food shortages. Dwarf wheat that was created in India and the rest, where they were able to harvest it more often, especially in India and the rest. I mean, revolutionized food and the way that we can look at things. And so that was one of those that has completely missed out on our being able to take care of each other. Declining population. Japan is going backwards in their population. They will not have enough workers to sustain their existing structure and their existing culture going forward because of the concept of overpopulation that they bought into. China, with its one-child policy, they will, as it is noted, they will grow old before they grow rich. In fact, it's going to be a massive catastrophe for China. It's why they've eased their one-child policy to now being 1-2-1-2, where if you're a one-child, single child, you can have two children. If you're one of the two, you can have one. Because they literally will not have enough workers to sustain even the existing infrastructures that they have within 20 years on the current population trends. So that led to the concept of the mass starvations that were going to happen. I mean, I read you some of the articles from that earlier. None of that has come to play outside of, and I want to be very careful here, outside of the mass starvation that happened under socialism in China and in Russia in the 1960s and 70s. outside of the forced starvation of individuals based off of terrible economic things, but they had nothing to do with the lack of access of food, globally speaking, based off of some climate disaster. It had everything to do with rationing and the rest. And so that was one of the key things that came out of that. One of the other arguments that's happened a lot with climate is resource depletion. The crude oil concept, believe it or not, fracking, and I've worked in the fracking fields before and the rest, completely changed what we'd be able to have access to. And this is a shocking number that might shock you. The oil underneath Texas alone, should all of it be able to be gotten to, would sustain America alone for the next 350 years, even if our population was to double. So that's based off of what is known to be underneath the state of Texas alone. So it's a fascinating concept, and especially when I noted the concept of innovation before, where you're now having electric cars and a lot of different things. Which, by the way, electric cars still require oil to run because how do you get electricity and the rest and coal? And so it's all coming around from the same thing. But even through our innovation, though, that number could exceedingly grow, not necessarily deplete. But there have been depletion arguments for over 60 years in the climate world that have simply not only not phased out, but they never took into account human ingenuity, the ability for us to change. Mass extinction. This is one of my favorite ones. On the first Earth Day, political sponsor Senator Gaylord Nelson warned Dr. Ripley, Secretary of the Smithsonian Institute, believes that in 25 years, somewhere between 75 and 80% of all species of living animals will be extinct. To put that in perspective, a 75% to 80% mass extinction is on the level of the cataclysm that people claim killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago, caused by the environmental catastrophe, a 6-mile wide meteor crashing into the Earth. Obviously, as we are here, nothing remotely like that has happened between 1970 and even today. Even close. But that was one of the major things that was spoken to by a senator specifically. The head secretary of the Smithsonian Institute noted that specific type of extinction was going to happen within 15 to 25 years. 70 to 80%. I mean, that's crazy. The renewable energy, and this isn't one of those things that I really want to dive into, but renewable energy is a massive industry within climate concept and the climate agenda that I'm a huge fan of in a lot of ways. I do believe we have to be careful that climate and renewable energy doesn't become just about the finances of it, because as someone who lived in Texas for a while, the lovely wind turbines that were there actually cost more in the long run than it did to run things that were just as clean, in essence. And so it's fascinating how that will work itself out. And obviously, kind of the last one, global warming, doesn't really not only fit into our narrative, but it doesn't actually work out at all the way people think or thought it would work out. In fact, like I said, when you look down to it, it's actually like what did I say, 0.08%. Yeah, you hate those stupid windmills. I totally get that. But 0.8% is the average change in climate over the last 150 years. And so if you go back further than that, it's actually, there was larger spikes of higher of the elements, in essence, and where climate was changing and so forth. So overall, I note all this, but I do want to say a couple of things, especially from the scriptural perspective on this. I do believe that God has placed mankind on the earth, and there's an aspect in where we are absolutely called to take care of it. I do not believe we are called to abuse the earth, and abuse is a very relative term. I'm well aware of that. But what I mean is that it is for our use. It is for us to be able to work and to keep and the rest. But it does not mean that it is there, that we are to get to a point where it is no longer usable in any way, shape, or form. That we do not use the resources that God has given us through the earth. You look at the beginning in Genesis 1, so then God blessed them, and God said to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And then you see Genesis 2:15, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. That there is things we are called to do when it specifically speaks of taking care of the earth, of not just simply utilizing all of it and tossing it about. So I'm a huge fan of the fact that people should recycle and we should do our best to reuse the resources that we have. I am not in the camp of we no longer use anything or everything is sacred and everything has a soul, which has become part of the climate change. And this is where I would go. There's a climate change religion that is happening in some ways where all animals have souls. All living creatures, all living things out there should never be used. And I'll give you just a kind of a ludicrous concept of this and how it comes about. It was actually from a show a couple months ago that I saw a little episode. It directly noted that a lot of people who are vegans for even self-imposed vegans, or they've decided that that is the way they want to eat and the rest. And I have no issue or qualms with that whatsoever. I do have a qualm if you think that it's doing something different than anybody else. So, as an example, there was vegans protesting on a roadway for an oil pipe something they were building, and the individual specifically came up to me and said, "What are you arguing about exactly? What do you like? Are all things?" He's like, "Well, you're tearing up the ground and you're killing these animals and you're destroying the earth and all these different things." Then he said, "What'd you have for breakfast?" And the guy said, "Avocado toast." Then he said, "Do you know how many things have to go into the ground that tear up, that kill bugs and all sorts of stuff for you to have your avocado toast?" And he goes through this whole entire process of this bug and this weevil and so forth, and they're laying the rest for you to have what you ate today that you think is better than what we are eating over here. And so I do believe that, especially if you have almost a religious mindset when it comes to climate change, when you spiritualize every aspect outside of the fact that humankind is made different, that we are made in the image of God, which means we have a soul, an eternal soul, and that seeks God, and that animals are different. Animals have personalities. They tend to react almost like humans, but they are not human. They are not. There is a difference between the two, and the earth is also the same way. I believe that Romans 8 specifically notes how even the earth itself groans to be made new, to be restored to the way it once was. Genesis. I go back to Genesis 1 and 2, that we are a people that live in Genesis 3, but we want to be back in Genesis 2, where everything was perfect and nothing died and everything was beautiful and wonderful. I believe the earth, in the same way, is that same concept, that the earth too groans for that. It kind of speaks for that, and I believe that that's something that we want to be careful, and we love the earth and we take care of it. That's why I'm not a climate change denier. I don't believe that humankind's have no impact. I, at the same time, do not believe for a second that we have the impact the climate scientists are currently saying we do, especially since you cannot see that in the numbers, not outside of cherry picked articles and things along the way. Now, I've read some articles where I've looked at, especially like smog or things like that, and the rest where I'm like, man, we absolutely should make that change. But globally speaking, the way that current conversation is happening, that we're all going to die, we've been hearing this for a while when it comes to the climate change agenda, and it's over and over and over and over again. So, do your research. Dive into the deep end. Don't be afraid to ask when somebody brings up something. Well, we know that people believe that this is happening, and go, "Can you tell me what the article is? I would love to read it." And be honest about it. Like, be genuine. Like, actually want to know what it is, and learn some of the language and the rest that you might need to have to be able to read and interpret these articles and to see what they mean. And sometimes it's as simple as coming in, and I've been blessed to be able to. I spend a lot of times with people who are very ardent advocates of climate change, and so I've been able to learn some of the lingo and the terminology and the rest with them. And I'm grateful that they spent the time with me to actually share their thoughts and tell me what they believe and why they believe it. But off of that, also, it allowed me to find articles and to go back and go, you noted this number, but that number does not. Here's what this is. What do you say about that? And what I found is some very genuine people went, "Oh, well, that 97% number, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense now with that concept, with that context, even." And so don't assume that people always buy in, but people who have a bumper sticker theology of religion or bumper sticker life view, where everything is just, 180 characters or less, we ought to start worrying. Instead, don't be afraid to ask for information. Ask for what else, where this might come from. So that's what I had for you tonight. It's a fantastic discussion to had. Please add more if you've got some thoughts or articles on the rest this coming week. Love to know more of what you might have in mind and what we might study together in the future. We are coming up. Let me look real quick to see what our next lovely topic will be. Which is, and I think we're getting into some interesting ones. Let's see here. Oh, okay. So next week is actually on racism. So we will be looking at racism next week. And actually, let me skip that because I'm going to come back around to that one because it ties into one of the other ones down at the bottom. And so we're actually going to dive into politics, which should be interesting, noting that President Trump was just indicted today. So, should be have a lot of fun in the coming weeks on some of these discussion, Christians and politics. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate you all. Please leave your thoughts, articles, comments. I love all the people who are adding where they're coming from, giving us background on them. Please continue to do that. I love you all. Hope you have a wonderful week. I will see you all next Thursday night as we gather together. And I hope it'll be a wonderful one. And until then, I hope you have a great time. God loves you. We'll see you soon.